Coming in at number 10, we have Terry L. Nichols. Nichols is a terrifying individual. He is known as the Oklahoma City Bomber, and he is responsible for killing nearly 200 people. He suffered from extreme paranoia, and while he was in the military, his paranoia grew. He was convinced that the government was up to something sinister, and a lot of his mentality was fueled by his partner in crime, Timothy J. McVeigh. The two of them met in the military, and after being released from duty, it would seem that they convinced themselves that they should make an attack against the American people and the bodies that govern them. They constructed a bomb and set it in the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. This explosion killed over 160 people and injured many more. It didn't take long for the police to track them down, and the two were arrested. After a thorough interrogation and investigation of the crime scene, it was determined that McVeigh had planned out most of the attack and was sentenced to death. This didn't mean that Nichols was going to walk away scot-free. He was given 161 years in prison and left there to be abandoned forever.
Moving on to number 9, we have Topeka State Hospital. The Topeka State Hospital, located in Kansas, operated from 1872 to 1997. And this hospital, much like the others on this list, has quite a dark history. So apparently in the early 20th century, a reporter visited the facility and witnessed some terrifying things. He said that he saw a patient that had been strapped down for so long that his skin was growing over the restraints, and there were other patients that were chained up like animals. But a majority of them just sat in the hallways on a rocking chair, rocking back and forth, staring at the walls all day. That's something straight out of a horror film. In our 8th spot, we have the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum began operating in 1964 and was designed to only hold 250 patients. However, it was soon housing more than 2,400 patients, which was very problematic. The place was extremely overcrowded, and patients started to become more and more violent. Soon they were starting fires and attacking the staff. In 1994, the asylum was forced to close due to a lot of violations. Now it's said that the building is haunted from the souls of the mistreated patients. In fact, the building is open to ghost tours if you want to go do some exploring. In our 7th spot, we have the Metropolitan State Hospital. Located in Massachusetts, this hospital opened in 1930 for patients with mental illnesses. But in 1980, something sinister happened that gave the hospital the nickname the Hospital of Seven Teeth. So back in 1978, a patient named Anna Marie Davey went out for a walk on the grounds, but she never returned. In 1980, the patient Melvin Wilson came forward saying that he had killed her and buried her body parts all around the grounds. Not only that, he kept 7 of her teeth as souvenirs. Hence the nickname, the Hospital of Seven Teeth. But that's not the only bad thing to happen there. Years before this incident, in the 1960s, a bunch of patients were accidentally poisoned, but this has never been confirmed. In 1992, the hospital was closed after psychiatric care in Massachusetts became more privatized. In our 6th spot, we have Rancho Los Amigos. In 1888, Rancho Los Amigos, located close to downtown LA, was originally created to assist people living in poverty. Over time, the hospital expanded and was home to the elderly, homeless, and individuals with disabilities. But over the years, it ended up changing to become mainly a mental hospital. The hospital was in full operation until the 1950s, when it started to shut down its wards, including the mental hospital. That's when they discovered the hospital had a more dark past. In 2006, after the hospital was abandoned, a freezer was discovered in the morgue. Inside of it were mummified, amputated limbs, and brain tissue samples. Guess they didn't want to take that with them. But this makes you wonder what really went down in this hospital. The original building is now abandoned, but it has moved to another location and is now called Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Back in 1912, this hospital opened up in Queens, New York for individuals that were said to be mentally ill. Most of the patients had psychosis or schizophrenia. It started off as a small institution with only 32 patients, but in 1959 it housed more than 7,000 1,000 patients. As a result, the hospital was very crowded and understaffed. In the 1970s, rumors spread like wildfire about murders, attacks, and suicides all happening in the hospital. In fact, it's said that one nurse hit a patient in a straitjacket across the throat with a club, which ended up crushing his throat, and as a result, he died from asphyxiation. Shortly after, the asylum was closed and left to rot. Making our way down the list, number 4, we have the GONJIAM Psychiatric Hospital. This next abandoned hospital is named one of the most haunted places in South Korea, and one of the freakiest places in the world. In fact, it's home to tons of urban legends. One legend states that the owner of the hospital was insane and kept the patients as his prisoners. Another version of the legend states that patients at the hospital started dying mysteriously, and that's what forced the hospital to close. In reality, the hospital closed in the 90s due to unsanitary conditions and lack of funding. Apparently because of this, the owner left the country, leaving no documentation behind about this building, so it was just abandoned. But to this day, people are convinced that the hospital is haunted. In fact, thousands of people break into the hospital each year just for the chance to catch a ghost. In our third spot, we have the ZELDA FITZGERALD Sanatorium. Built in 1859, this sanatorium, once called Tioranda, was originally built for the Civil War officer General Joseph Howland. Then in 1915 it was converted into a psychiatric hospital. In 1934, novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald took his wife Zelda there with hopes to cure her schizophrenia. Hence why people now refer to it as the Zelda FITZGERALD Sanatorium. However, it is probably most known for housing the patient Frances Seymour, aka actress Jane Fonda's mother. Frances ended up taking her own life there after cutting her throat with a razor in 1942. In 1999, the hospital closed and of course is now said to be haunted. In our second spot, we have Athens Lunatic Asylum. Yes, that's the actual name of this asylum. Located in Athens, Ohio, the asylum was built in 1874 for patients with tuberculosis. However, over the years it became way too overcrowded and understaffed. As a result, patients were being mistreated. Over the years, the hospital turned into a place for the mentally ill. This is when the man Dr. Walter Jackson comes into play. Dr. Jackson loved transorbital lobotomies. He believed that it could cure all mental illnesses. So at this hospital, he performed 200 lobotomies. I'm telling you right now that many did not go so well. But that's not the only freaky thing to happen there. A patient known as Margaret Schilling went missing while in the ward. A month later, her body was found locked in a room in an abandoned section of a ward. In fact, her decaying body left a nasty stain on the ward's floor that can still be seen today. And in our number 1 spot, we have Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Located in Kentucky, this hospital was originally built in 1910 as a hospital for patients with tuberculosis. Sadly, tons of patients ended up dying from the disease. The hospital did more harm than good. Rumor goes that the hospital was mistreating their patients and conducting experiments on them. In fact, they had an area in the hospital called the death tunnel or body chute where they would dump the deceased. It's also said that one nurse hung herself in room 502, and in that same room another nurse died from falling out of the window. The hospital closed in 1961 upon the discovery of an antibiotic that could treat and cure tuberculosis. As a result, there was no need for the hospital. Now it's said that it's an extremely haunted building. Apparently, people have seen tons of apparitions there. The most famous one being of a boy named Timmy, who likes to play with rubber balls. He also likes to run from room to room. It's said that if you roll a small ball down a hallway, then Timmy will roll it back to you.
Coming in at number 10 is Sabenta Prison in Maracaibo, Venezuela. Said to be one of the most violent prisons in the world, Sabenta was named the gateway to the 5th circle of hell by former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. The prison was originally built to house 700 inmates, but it currently has more than 3,700. The prisoner to guard ratio is 150 to 1, so maintaining any sort of order is pretty much a distant dream. Armed inmates control the prison in a sort of gang-controlled hierarchy. The poorer ones have to pay the more powerful ones for a place to sleep or even water to drink. That water, by the way, comes from corroded bathroom pipes. In 1994, 108 inmates were killed in a prison riot. War between gangs even led to dismemberment and beheadings. This may seem surprising, but Venezuela is ranked second in the world for homicide rates, so after hearing that, you can kind of imagine the sort of people that are probably in this prison.
Coming in at number 9, we have Richard Lee McNair. To break out of jail once is pretty crazy, but to break out of jail 3 times, that's going to get you on the abandoned prisoner list. So between the years of 1988 and 2006, Richard McNair was able to slip out of prison 3 times. The first time he escaped, he was caught almost immediately, but the 2 other times he was able to spend a few years as a free man before they snagged him again. He's now locked down mostly in solitary confinement, so he should never be heard from again. Coming in at number 8, we have Steve Selvin. Not everyone who gets locked away and abandoned did something terrible. Steve Selvin was picked up for drunk driving. He was taken to jail and locked up and then moved to a prison while he was awaiting his trial. Some of the prisoners were concerned that he was suicidal, and so they moved Selvin into solitary confinement, and then they left him there for 2 years. He would occasionally be let out for his allotted hour a day where he was allowed to go outside, but this was only if the guards remembered to do it, which they would often forget about. He had a cavity while he was locked up which he had to remove on his own, and on top of all of this, he never had a trial. They locked him up with no trial. They just moved him in there and then they just left him there like he was some sort of animal that should be forgotten. He was released and then he took the state to court and he walked away with $15 million. The reason that he was abandoned was literally because he was just left behind in the prison system and no one wanted to deal with him. Coming at number 7, we have Juan Navarro. After 37 years in prison, Juan Navarro was 78 years old and finally released from prison. He was originally accused of killing his own mother, which at first glance sounds like something horrible. How on earth could someone do such a thing? But when you go back through the records, it would seem that he might have never committed the crime. Most of the records that were connected to the crime were destroyed when a riot happened several years into his sentence, and the few files that were available showed that he never stood trial. He was literally taken to prison, and because he had no family to speak for him or come for him, he was forgotten. He was kept in a prison in Peru that was infamous for having some of the most ruthless criminals in the country. On more than one occasion, people in the prison tried to murder him. To make his story even more heartbreaking, by the time he was released from prison, he was already showing signs of dementia. He might have had a daughter when he was locked up, but he couldn't remember. Coming at number 6, we have Alexander Timoheva. Alexander was working in Russia at a meat packing plant, and he was one of the head technicians, and because of his work he had to move to Kiev in the Ukraine for a year so he could work at another plant. On his return from Russia, he and his family were stopped and questioned. Alexander was taken away, and then his family was forced to leave him behind and return to their home. Upon their return, his wife Svetlana started to get phone calls demanding that they pay $20,000 for Alexander or he would be murdered. She refused to pay the money, and then they started making claims that they would come for her son next. Out of fear, Svetlana had to flee back to Kiev. 2 years later, she saw a YouTube video of Alexander admitting that he was a spy for the Ukraine, but this was most likely a forced confession so they could justify imprisoning him for what would be a 14-year sentence. This all happened because of corruption and because the family didn't want to give in to corrupt demands. Coming in at number 5, we have Eddie Collins. He was someone who was placed into prison for 44 years for first-degree murder when he was only 17 years old. When you hear first-degree murder, you probably think that's someone who might have deserved to go to jail, but when you break down the story a little further, it was really a case of a horrible economic situation. Eddie had been living on the street since he was a kid and really doing whatever he could to try and survive. He was caught up in a bad life, but when you're that young and all you've known is poverty, then there really isn't a lot of options for you. Eddie went to pull off a drug deal one day and things got a little hairy. He pulled out a gun to defend himself and he shot the person dead. He was caught and locked up and actually made it to the other end of his 44-year sentence so he could walk away a free man. Coming in at number 4, we have Robert P. Hanssen. This is the type of story that movies are made of. Robert P. Hanssen was once one of the most respected people in American intelligence. He worked for the FBI, and for most of his 25-year career it seemed that he was always always looking out for the best interest of the American people. That was until he slipped up. He was about to be someone who would be abandoned in prison forever when his whole life would come tumbling down in 2001. What was the reasoning behind this? Well, it looked like Robert had been secretly selling off American intel to the Russians for a huge portion of his career, and he wasn't doing this for some honorable reason either. He wasn't some guy who was secretly Russian and wanted to see Russia move into the top spot of the world stage. No, he did this for money. This guy was selling out his whole country for a few bucks. Well, more than a few bucks. It turns out he made somewhere around $1.4 million, which actually seems kind of cheap for secret government files. I mean, I think 2 Chainz wears more money around his neck. Well, now he's forgotten in jail forever. Coming in at number 3, we have Robert Stroud. He might be one of the most violent inmates to come into the American prison system. He was originally locked up for manslaughter after he killed a bartender. From there, it seemed that he never wanted to be let go from prison, as he would go on to kill a fellow inmate and then get transferred to another prison, and then he would kill a prison guard and get sentenced to life in prison, where he was sent to Alcatraz to be forgotten forever. Coming in at number 2, Pascal Payet. How many times do you need to break out of prison before they bury you in a hole and forget about you? Well, it seems like the number is 3. Pascal Payet is one of the most notorious prisoners in French history for this exact reason. He was able to sneak away from prison back to back to back. And when I say sneak away, I mean he had a crew of men flying in with a helicopter and airlift him out like he was in a James Bond movie. Well, that's what happened the first time. What happened the second time? Actually, the exact same thing. Okay, well, what happened the third time? Well, the same thing again. 3 helicopter escapes for one dude. This guy must be pretty important. Well, after the 3rd escape, he was caught again and locked up in a secret location where he probably will be abandoned for the rest of his days. Coming in at the number 1 spot, we have Rami Youssef, one of the 7 people that were involved in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. This was a massive explosion that ripped apart the base of the building and injured thousands of people. The bomb that was used weighed over 1,300 pounds. After the attack, the CIA went to work and were able to snag 6 of the 7 people involved in the attack, Rami Youssef being one of them. After his sentencing, he was thrown away for 240 years, and I doubt we will ever hear from him again.
Starting off this countdown, we have Rolling Hills Asylum. Established in 1827, the Rolling Hills Asylum was originally a working farm that was converted into a home for the less fortunate. Then it went on to be a place for widows, orphans, alcoholics, criminals, and individuals with mental illnesses. But it closed its doors in 1974. Apparently, it's said that over 1,700 people died there. Hundreds are currently buried all over the property in unmarked graves, which makes this place very haunted. Visitors claim to have heard screaming and doors slamming. Others have seen the apparition of Roy Cruz, a 7.5-foot tall man who died there in 1942. And the hospital even has something known as a shadow hallway, a hallway where you can see tons of ghostly apparitions.
At number 9 is Cat's Eye in Thailand. As nice as the name is, the place itself is far from it. Cat's Eye was a secret CIA prison set up in 2002 to hold Abu Zubaydah, who's suspected to be one of bin Laden's right-hand men. He was the only inmate of the prison for 6 months, and he lived inside a coffin-sized box and was constantly waterboarded nearly every day until he fainted. The second prisoner arrived in November 2002, and both were used to test out enhanced interrogation techniques, whatever the hell that means. They were also subject to walling, which is basically a punishment where they were slammed against a wall. A month later, the prison was apparently shut down and moved to Poland, but no one can actually confirm this. I mean, till this day, no one even knows the location of Cat's Eye. That's how secret it is. Coming in number 8 is the Salt Pit in Afghanistan. This prison is a secret prison run by the CIA. Not so secret, I guess. And it was meant to hold inmates suspected of having links with terrorists. The Salt Pit used to be a brick factory, so its cells are extremely small and obviously have no toilets or windows. Most inmates just have one bucket in their room and have to sleep on the cold floor absolutely naked. All of them are subject to inhumane treatment and punishments like frequent mock executions. Like, how do you pretend to kill someone just to scare someone else? I mean, that is disgusting. The guards also play really loud music throughout the day as psychological torture. Only 1 death has been verified by the prison, and the inmate was chained above his head, stripped, beaten, and drenched, and then he died of hypothermia the next day. His family was never informed. At number number 7 now, we have black jails in China. These are secret prisons illegally run by individual Chinese provinces and local governments. If someone has a grievance of any kind, they have to report it to their provincial or local government, and if they don't get the justice they wanted, they're allowed to send that same report to the central government in Beijing. Now, the number of reports coming in from each province decides how effective that government is. So, to avoid being deemed ineffective, these local governments seek out the same people who send reports to the central government. They employ more than 10,000 people to kidnap, torture, and detain these people, and the prisons they're put in are usually vacant homes, guest houses, or psychiatric wards. By 2009, it was confirmed that there are around 73 black jails inside Beijing alone, and the central government knows about it and is doing nothing about it. Great. Coming at number 6 is the USS Ashland. This is the name of one of the 17 US warships that the CIA has secretly been using as prisons. There's a total of 26,000 people held on these ships. Most ships carry at least 500 Marines to take care of the ship and guard the prisoners. The ships are common for people who have been abducted and detained in foreign countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, etc. Not much is actually known about what goes on in these floating prisons, but it's said that even when the ships are docked, prisoners are never allowed to get off, and likely rarely ever leave their holding cells. I get really seasick, so I can't even imagine if a prisoner who also got seasick ended up being one of these prisoners on these floating prisons. I'd probably want to kill myself. At number 5 is Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. Camp Lemonnier is located right next to Djibouti's Ambouli International Airport and is meant to be a US naval expeditionary base. But it's never just a naval base, is it? It's also used by the CIA as a black site where dozens and dozens of people are secretly kidnapped, then tortured, and then interrogated. Since it's located right in between terrorist hot zones like Somalia and Yemen, inmates flood into the camp on a weekly basis, and a lot of them never make it out, or if they do, they never speak about what was done to them in the camp. Whether that's because they were paid off or threatened, who knows? You guys decide. Coming at number 4 is Camp 7 of Guantanamo Bay. Yes, I know that isn't a secret by any stretch of the imagination, but no one actually knows where Camp 7 is. It was built away from the main prison and was used for 15 inmates who the CIA dubbed as high-value detainees, one being the person behind 9/11 apparently. If inmates already get tortured at the other camps, multiply that by a fairly large number, and that's the sort of level and frequency of torture you get at Camp 7. During his hearing, one inmate even claimed his cell used to make strange noises and vibrate, and it turned out to be true, since the building itself was falling apart and they're still keeping inmates in there. Talk about bad conditions. At number 3 now is the Tamara Interrogation Center in Morocco. I know it doesn't have prison in the title, but it is one. The center is located in a forest and is operated by a Moroccan government unit that goes by the acronym DST. Now, DST has violated so many human rights at the Tamara Interrogation Center, I can't even begin the list. The interrogators beat their inmates, burn them, electrocute them, waterboard them, you name it, they do it to them. And the reason behind all this, you ask? To extract confessions or information or make the inmates sign statements they have zero knowledge of. The US has confirmed that the CIA funds the center, whereas Morocco denies the center even exists. Something doesn't add up. What do you guys think? Coming at number 2 are a series of unnamed Yemeni prisons. According to the Human Rights Watch, a very trustworthy source, mind you, says they've been informed by various people that there is a huge network of secret Yemeni prisons in eastern Yemen. The anonymous people that have come forward to talk about what goes on in there have said people suffer from sexual harassment and threats, electrical shocks, sleep and sensory deprivation, beatings with metal tools, and being stripped and whipped. Yemeni family members of those who have quote-unquote disappeared for months at a time never get a word about whether that person is alive, where they are, what they're doing, absolutely nothing. Last but not least, coming in with a bang at number 1 is a secret Iraqi government prison that is yet to be named. This prison is so horrific it's been labeled worse than the Abu Ghraib prison. The prison is located in an airfield west of Baghdad, and prisoners were taken there after being arrested for acting against the state. Freed captors have said they were suffocated, electrocuted, and raped while being inside the prison. One man went to Iraq to find his missing son, and they arrested him, beat him, sodomized him, attached electrical charges to his private parts, and then forced him to sign a confession which he didn't even get to read. Another inmate said he was raped on a daily basis and was beaten so badly he had serious leg injuries and lost his front teeth. The things I read and found out while reading about this one, you guys, you could not even imagine. Those two examples were horrific enough, and I only included 2 out of the many that I read. Some things you literally can't unsee, or in this case, unread.